In this lecture, we will talk about spectrum management, the major regulations in this scope. We will take some details related to the plan of the United Kingdom. We will also explain how ultra-wideband works and what is the idea behind open spectrum. Basically, radio communication is a shared medium. Any number of transmissions may share the same space. What started as a relatively simple problem of accommodating a few broadcasters in each country has become extremely complex when you think of the many ways in which radio is used now. Take this quotation from the article Radio Spectrum Management for Tetherless Communication by Dixon. Read carefully this part of the article. You will get a good introduction to the radio spectrum management in wireless environment. You will also look at plans for spectrum management by the British regulator OfCom, which is the Office of Communication. Look to the Spectrum Framework Review. You can find here a quotation of the executive summary. Take an idea about that by reading the following executive summary. Read the following instructions to get the general structure of articles of our paper. While the spectrum available for use is large and growing, the propagation characteristics of the highest frequencies rule them out for some applications. Also, in general, the design and manufacture of transmitters, receivers, and the electronic components they contain become more technically challenging, and the highest frequencies and costs remain high until a mass market develops. So radio spectrum remains a scarce resource. What are the underlying considerations to take into account? Spectrum management is not just about dividing up the frequency spectrum and allocating chunks to different services and operators, but also imposes limits on the amount of power they can transmit. Reducing power may make unwanted interference less likely, but may also reduce the usable area of service. Spectrum management is thus predominantly about negotiating compromises between the many competing interests. In fact, what are the factors affecting the maximum area of coverage? First of all, we have the transmitter power, the bandwidth of the transmitted signal, method of modulation, propagation characteristics of the path between the transmitter and the receivers may change with time. For example, with atmospheric conditions, this may result in inadequate reception on the one hand, or transmission over extreme distances outside the intended area of coverage on the other. Other factors that affect the maximum area of coverage is the sensitivity of the receiver. Receiver sensitivity is a measure of the ability of the receiver to detect weak signals. However, even with a very sensitive receiver, effective communication may not be possible because of noise. Electric noise can swamp radio signals, just as it can be difficult or impossible to hold a conversation in a noisy room. Channel capacity is related to the signal-to-noise ratio through channels equations that we have already explained in the last weeks. As we have already seen, C, the channel capacity, is equal to the channel bandwidth W multiplied by log base to 1 plus SNR, signal to noise ratio. So we have already seen that there is logarithmic relationship between the channel capacity and the signal to noise ratio. Noise sources can be divided into natural and artificial sources. Natural sources of noise example lighting, auroras, and solar activity. Little can be done about this type of noise. Where other type of noise is artificial sources of noise, as interference from unwanted radio transmissions, interference from most electrical equipment. An antenna is just a conductor or conductors carrying electrical currents that vary with time. Your PC, TV, washing machine, and car are all packed with conductors carrying electric currents which vary with time and can potentially act as antennas. High frequencies and transient sudden changes in electric current, for example, when switching lights or motors, are particularly troublesome. Electromagnetic compatibility (EMC) means that devices do not affect and are not affected by other devices. There are two aspects to EMC. Emissions. There are limits to the amount of power a device is allowed to radiate at different frequencies when that is not its intended function. And the other aspect of EMC is immunity. The device must function normally in the presence of radio waves up to a certain power at different frequencies. You would not want your PC to crash whenever you made a call from your mobile phone, for example. Competition. For successful reception, the wanted radio signal must be strong enough to compete with the unwanted transmissions from transmitters using the same frequency or band of frequencies. It's function of spectrum management to alleviate problems in this area. Natural noise, a quantity which is difficult to predict but which is normally at a low level in the context of applications in this course. Artificial noise from unrelated equipment. This is controlled at the product design stage. Noise generated from the receiver itself, random movement of electrons with temperature. We should consider also the effect of antennas. This could be expressed in terms of polarization when two broadcasting transmitters using the same frequency but covering different surface areas are less likely to interfere with each other if one uses horizontal polarization and the other uses vertical polarization. Directionality can be described through two methods: beam width and antenna gain. Beam width, the beam is regarded as a cone emanating from the transmitter antenna, and the beam width is the angle at the point of the cone. The cone only includes radiation which is more than a certain power, often have the maximum power, as this is the most significant part of the beam. Antenna gain, a very directional antenna will have a narrow beam width and a high gain. What does the spectrum need to be managed? Too many people, the need to manage the radio spectrum is an unnecessary burden, which is seen to restrict use of the frequency bands and slow down innovation. However, spectrum management is necessary for very good reasons. The users of the radio spectrum are many and varied, and so are their radio systems, which are used for much more than communications. There are some services for radio communications listed in this slide. We have already seen at the start of these blocks how the microwave bands are decomposed into different bands, which are VLF, LF, MF, HF, VHF, UHF, SHF, and EHF. We have seen that low frequencies, VLF, LF, and then medium frequencies, HF, and then we can start with the microwave frequencies, which have higher frequencies and provide the applications wider channel bands, which could improve the quality of service and the more specifically the bit rate of the wireless applications. Radio regulations is a global international treaty that forms a framework for the use of all the frequency bands from 9 kHz to 3000 GHz. The radio regulations contain a very large table in which each subdivision of each frequency band is allocated to a particular service. The upper limit of the allocation table is 275 GHz in 2003. The allocations in the table are made on either a primary or secondary basis. Transmitters should not interfere with other users that are already operating in the band, but a primary user has priority over a secondary user. The geographical flexibility, the allocation in the radio regulations can apply to all of the world, global allocation, or alternatively to 1, 2, or 3 of the following regions. Region 1, Europe, Africa, Middle East, and the countries of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Region 2, the Americas, and Region 3, the Asia Pacific. Changes to the radio regulations are made by the ITUR, World Radio Conference, WRC. Held every few years. The ITU has a structure of study group, SG, and working parties, WP, to undertake the necessary technical studies. For example, SG1 is spectrum management, SG3 radio wave propagation, and so on for every other dedicated study group. National spectrum management. Radio regulations provide a basic framework for the allocation of frequency bands. Radio regulations are not intended to remove the need for licensing of systems, which is done on a national basis. In the UK, the use of all radio transmissions equipment is licensed by the Radio Communications Agency. It becomes in 2003 part of the new Office of Communication, OfCom. In Lebanon, the Telecommunication Regulatory Authority (TRA) is assigned to liberalize, regulate, and develop the telecommunication sectors in Lebanon. The website of this regulatory authority is tra.gov.lb. And so for the other countries, each country will have such a committee which is responsible for liberalizing and regulating and developing the telecommunication sectors in its country. To bridge the gap between global framework and the national licensing policy, there are a number of regional regulatory bodies, except for Europe and for Pacific and CETL for America. CEPT, European Conference of Post and Telecommunications, its purpose is to harmonize the national regulations throughout Europe. CEPT has created the Electronic Communication Committee, which tries to harmonize the policy on the use and regulations of radio spectrum throughout Europe. Self-legislated band, each band is for a single purpose. 2004 OfCom published the Spectrum Framework Review, followed in 2005 as a more detailed Spectrum Framework Review implementation plan. These are consultation documents proposing quite radical changes in the way spectrum is allocated. They are published at the OfCom website, which has a great deal of useful information about communications in the UK. These are fairly long documents, and you are not expected to read them deeply. However, like many documents of this type, they have executive summaries which provide you an easily readable overview. If you look at the OfCom Spectrum Framework Review, we can compare the current and future bands of spectrum use. In this case, we have the distribution of spectrum usage in 2000 and in 2010. You can see in 2000 that the license extent is 4.3 and in 2010 is 6.9. And the command and control in 2000 is 95.7 and in 2010 it's 71.5%. These are going to increase the percentage of market mechanisms and to liberate the spectrum from many restrictions. So to promote the usage of radio spectrum in the future. Liberalization. The aim here is to remove unnecessary restrictions so that licensees can more easily change the technology or type of use that they make of their piece of spectrum. While the Spectrum Framework Review gave only preliminary ideas about how this must be done, a later OfCom consultation on spectrum usage rights in 2006 added some more details. Liberalization is intended to give more flexibility and efficiency. For example, it would help avoid the situation where a piece of spectrum is allocated to a new service, which subsequently fails to attract users, leaving the spectrum underutilized. Under liberalization, the license holder might use a spectrum entitlement for a different purpose or trade it with someone else. Liberalization need to be done with careful, as changes in use by license holders could affect the interference experienced by their neighbors. The proposal on spectrum usage rights differ quite radically from traditional command and control provisions, which have concentrated on transmitter powers, bandwidth, and types of modulation. Spectrum usage rights would specify the emissions that may be radiated into neighboring geographical locations and the frequency bands. This information can be more useful to neighboring license holders, as it indicates how much interference they can reasonably expect. Try to work on this activity. License exemption. The main changes in the Spectrum Framework Review are a major increase in the market mechanism as opposed to command and control, and some increase in the license exempt sector. License exemption is the only practicable solution for tetherless devices. License exemption means there is no license fee to pay. But you should not get the idea that there are no rules in license exemption bands. There are quite stringent limits on power to limit the risk of interference. There is only a limited amount of spectrum available for license exempt bands. This band is called ISM bands, which has abbreviation for industry, science, and medical. ISM bands are also used for radio communication services, but radio communication services operating within these bands must accept harmful interference which may be caused by these applications, as quoted from ITUR. Look to some frequencies in the ISM bands. The choice of frequency band for a radio system. The choice is compromised based on lower frequency bands. Cheaper equipment, lower attenuation of the signal relative to travel distance. Radio signals are better at diffracting around corners. Less areas in a radio shadow. Higher frequency bands, the bands are higher bandwidth, capable of providing more capacity. Ultra-wideband devices, UWB, ultra-wideband. This technology has been proposed as a new technique for short-range devices. The idea is that the signal power spread over a wide band of spectrum, several gigahertz in fact, from 3.1 to 10.6 gigahertz. As the power spread so thinly in milliwatt per megahertz, the fraction of the power in any frequency band shared with a conventional user is very small, in principle small enough to be insignificant. This is a new area for the regulation authorities. It was mentioned briefly in the OfCom spectrum framework review, but was referred to another consultation. How low does the power density have to be for UWB to operate without affecting other devices? The power density is measured in milliwatt per megahertz. 1 milliwatt per megahertz is a large unit in this context. And in practice, UWB transmissions would use a tiny fraction of 1 milliwatt per megahertz. Often dBm per megahertz is used to avoid very small numbers. dBm is a logarithmic measure of power relative to 1 milliwatt. As we have seen in the previous lecture, we can express dBm as 10 log base 10, the power divided by 1 milliwatt. So in this case, 1 watt is 30 dBm, and 1 microwatt is equivalent to minus 30 dBm. As a measure of power density, then, 0 dBm per megahertz represents the total power of 1 milliwatt in every 1 megahertz slice of spectrum. OfCom proposed a mask based on the FCC proposals for UWB, but with reduced emissions on various defined frequency ranges to protect existing services. Notice that the figure of minus 41.3 dBm per megahertz still applies over much of the frequency range, but there are notches where lower emissions figures may be needed in order to protect radar and radio astronomy. Also shown in an area below 3.8 GHz, where a detect and avoid DAA mechanism is proposed. Under DAA, UWB device should be capable of detecting other services that require protection. If such a service is detected, the UWB device should automatically reduce its emissions to a much lower level. Despite the complex system of regulation in spectrum management, parts of the spectrum are often underutilized. One suggestion is that a radio system could seek out unused parts of the spectrum for itself. This type of system is sometimes referred to as cognitive radio and is related to the idea of detect and avoid. This part related to open spectrum in the papers. Dynamic frequency selection (DFS) is a key to solving the 5 GHz sharing problem. The airline always checks the frequency bandwidth both before and during use to ensure that no radars are occupying the same radio channel. This feature was first specified in the SAP decision and is now generally believed to be the solution to the band sharing problem. Much will depend on the values of the parameters which are specified for the detection and identification of the radar system. Common issues for open spectrum often pointed to another of the possible objections. Two devices may be hidden from each other by an obstruction such as building so that they cannot detect each other. However, a third device might be visible to both of them, and they might both try to transmit to it at the same time. This is a version of what is called the hidden station problem. Also, some services which need protection do not transmit but only receive, for example, radio astronomy, and they would not be detected by such a system.